Hello.
Hello, Bob. Good to be here with you on our maiden interview.
Our maiden interview. And we have a spectacular guest for that maiden interview, Tammy Patrick, with whom we served on the Presidential Commission on Election Administration from 2013 to 2014. Let me give a brief bio and then we'll open it up to questions, Tammy. But welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, it is a joy to be here.
For our audience, we want to note Tammy is the Chief Programs Officer at the Elections Center, which for years has devoted resources and expertise to the support of professional election administration. Tammy herself has worked in election administration from 2003 to 2013, or to the present day, rather. In addition to her service on the Commission on Election Administration, she then helped the Bipartisan Policy Center with a program to implement the Election Administration Commission recommendations. And key, before that, she was the federal compliance officer for 11 years for the Maricopa County Elections Department. Tammy has testified before the Senate and the House on behalf of both parties, that is the U.S. Senate, the U.S. House, and in various state legislatures. So we welcome her today, and we are delighted. I'll turn it over to Ben, and we'll start, Tammy, picking your brain on the key and hot election issues of the day in this midterm election cycle.
Tammy, it's great to have you. For starters, the Election Center, in which you play such a key role, has how many members who are election administrators out there around the country?
I actually looked a little bit earlier today, and we have over 2,000 election professionals that are our members. And the one distinction I will say is that it's the only national association for election professionals across all levels of government. So we have municipal clerks, county auditors, county supervisors, secretaries of state, federal election assistance commissioners. So it's all levels of government. And then we do have about 100 or so members each that are from the corporate world, as well as special members in the nonprofit sector. So we really do encompass all professionals across the board.
And so last year, Bob and I had the pleasure of addressing the annual meeting of the Election Center. And I know I speak for Bob, which does not always happen, in saying we were really impressed with the breadth of election officials who were there. So for starters, give us a sense of what election officials are seeing and having to deal with in a time when there's certainly a lot of public attention to election administration.
I often say that everything old is new again, but with a twist. And it seems like each election cycle, we tend to revisit some of the core principles and core functions around our elections and election administration. But there's always some new nuance or some new wrinkle or ripple in how that issue is going to come to pass. So for instance, in this moment, we are thinking about and having to comprehend how are election officials going to staff and fund their activities in this new year, given the funding challenges that they're facing. So we know that the federal government has changed some funding structures to the states and to localities in a myriad of areas, not necessarily elections, but there is that ripple effect that'll come to elections because those funds have to be secured somewhere. So what I'm hearing in this moment is that election officials are still seeing people leave the field, members of their office, going to find other jobs. And in many cases, they're being told that they cannot fill that vacancy. In other places, property taxes are down, other revenues are down, and they're being told they need to scale back their existing staff. And I think it's important to remember that, some of the survey work that's happened in the last couple of years really gives us a better understanding of our election offices around the country. And there are a couple of key data points I always like to mention, and that is a third of our election offices in this country do not have a full-time employee. 34% don't have a full-time employee working on elections. And we know that because in our rural areas all across the country, small offices, they do a lot of different things. They are not only the election official, but they're the clerk of the court. They do dog licenses. And in some cases, they're in charge of thawing the cemetery plots. and that is a real thing. And so in this moment, we know that in many of these cases, these offices that are already constrained are having further funding constraints. And that's really going to be a challenge because they're still having the same number of elections. They're still serving, in many cases, the same number of voters, if not more voters. And they're having to do so in an environment where they're unsure in some cases what the district lines are going to be, or what exactly to expect out of various agencies in other levels of government, and how they will address those concerns. And so none of that is new. They're ongoing challenges. Election offices are often starved for resources. But in this moment, it's a little bit different because of how it's coming at the election officials and all of the other things that they're having to deal with.
Can you say something about, I want to ask you a follow-up question on that, but just as a structural matter, what sort of support does the election center provide? How does it change from a non-election year to an election year if it does?
So the National Association of Election Officials, which is Election Center, it's the long name, we really conduct our business the same from one year to the next. So we do two main things. One is we serve as a network and a convener of election professionals. So we have 4 different events a year. We start off in January with a meeting in Washington, D.C., where we meet with federal partners and other agencies to talk about what's going to happen in the upcoming year. We hear from Hill's staff and others what they anticipate happening in the upcoming year when they can talk about it. And then we have a couple of workshops in the spring and our annual conference in the fall, late summer. So that's every year. And throughout the year, we conduct our training and certification programs in collaboration with Auburn University, and our state-based programs in collaboration with either state associations and or the state's chief election official authority. So those classes and trainings are ongoing every month. And we train hundreds of election officials every month and thousands over the course of the year, thousands of classes, I should say, of people taking them. So that is kind of the day-to-day work. And that too has not changed in the last 40 years that the agency, the organization has been around. But what we are seeing is that there are more individuals that are seeking out this certification, that are able to participate in these certification programs. And really what we talked about in the PCEA, the professionalizing of the field. Because the field itself, the expectation we have of what our election administrators need to do in order to conduct a trustworthy, a safe, secure, and accessible election is really evolving. And we require them to have more and more skills. Now we are talking about a lot of AI and how can we leverage AI in elections for good, not for bad, because there's enough of examples of how that can manifest. And so we're really trying to make sure that election officials have the tools and resources available to make sure that not only are they serving their voters well and under the statutory requirements of the laws in their state and federal requirements, but that across a state, there is as close to a uniformity of understanding of those requirements and policies and practices as one can get. Because we know that one of my other favorite data points is that 75% of our nation's election officials serve 8% of the voters. It's all the rural and small locations. And 8% of our election officials, our election offices, serve 75% of the nation's electorate. Those two very, very distinct operating paradigms for these offices have a lot of differences in their requirements and the resources they have available in order to serve all voters in the state, whether they're in that urban area or in a rural location, equally. And so that's really what we focus in on, is making sure that the innovations that happen in this great experiment, that they're shared across offices, across district lines, whether that district is a county or a state line.
That's excellent. So let's drill down a little bit into sort of the news of the day. You're talking to a lot of election administrators. Could you compare sort of the atmosphere before the 2020 election and the 2024 election, and then where it is now? How are administrators feeling about that?
I think that after the 2020 election, if we just close our eyes for a minute and remember wiping down our groceries or leaving them to age, on the porch before bringing them into the house, and all the things that we did, the social distancing and all of the uncertainty of the times in 2020, and the fact that we had an election, a presidential election that was not a super spreader event, which is a testament to all of the resources that election officials had at their disposal, both from the federal government as well as from philanthropy, to make sure that voters were safe and secure in casting their ballot. At the end of that election, you would have thought that election officials would have gotten ticker tape parades for really doing an amazing job at making sure that the election was conducted on time and that voters had options in how to vote safely and securely. But we know that that's not what happened after 2020. The threats and the harassment started, and it was really the first election where it never seemed to be done. It never seemed to be over. There were, 60 some court cases. And normally, as you both are well aware, after the court cases are done and the canvas is certified, the winners are certified and take office, you might complain a little bit about the election, but it didn't carry on in the same way that the 2020 election is still being debated by some in this moment. Just last week, recently, there were materials that were confiscated in Fulton County. Those ballots were counted multiple times. So after the 2020 election, the atmosphere around election administration really shifted. And it's been referred to by some as the great retiring or the great exodus from the profession, because we've lost a lot of election officials. Because people don't want to have to wear Kevlar vests to work in their county elections office. They don't want to have to worry about snipers. They don't appreciate their homes being shot up. They don't appreciate the hate mail and the other things that are still going on to this day in 2026. Now, after 2024's election, nobody's talking about the 2024 election because there were some who were satisfied with the outcome and believed that because their person won, it demonstrated the legitimacy of the election. And that's something we have to get away from. We have to get back to a time where we can be disappointed in the outcome of election, but agree that it was fairly conducted, that it was observable, that it was transparent, and that every legal course of action that could be taken to produce evidence of fraud or malfeasance was explored and demonstrated in court. And when that's done, we all have to agree that, maybe our team won, maybe they didn't. But we should all be able to move forward. And I think that we're hopeful that we'll get back to that time sometime soon. I don't know if it's 2026, but I remain woefully optimistic.
Let me ask you a question, and this is something Ben and I have been concerned with about that 20 to 21 to 24 period. In this last election, it's certainly true, there was no post-election contestation at the presidential level. Our sense of it was that there was a real effort, certainly on the part of the organizations that Ben and I worked together on, and certain others, to rally communities in support of professional election administrators, to provide them a defense against unjustified attacks on the quality of their work, on the integrity of their work. Now, it wasn't tested, of course, to the maximum because there wasn't that post-election fracas. But do you feel that there has been some reaction to these threats, these pressures, these unjustified critiques that were proven to be somewhat useful in the 23-24 period, and that election officials can look behind them and believe that there is support for them should these kinds of criticisms intensify?
I think there's good news and bad news. And I think the good news is that election officials have learned a lot in the last few years around making sure that they are being as transparent as they can be within the parameters of their state law, and that they are better equipped to tell their story well, to explain what it is that the voter, the media, the public are seeing. And they're able to set up the situation so that it can't be taken out of context, distorted, contorted, and turned into something that it is not. What I mean by this is so I was an election official in Arizona, and since 2007, they've had a law that their tabulation center was viewable online by cameras 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And we thought, 20 years ago that was crazy. Who was going to ever pay any attention to any of that? Well, fast forward 10, 20 years, and it is now a more common practice. But what's important is that not only can people see what's happening, but that they understand the context of what's happening, so that you have signage that is in the frame of the camera shot that says what's happening at a ballot duplication station. So yes, there are people marking ballots because they're taking a ballot that was unreadable, and a bipartisan team are marking a ballot that can then be read by a machine. Instead of having it just be a bunch of people looking like they're stuffing the ballot box, you can see a big sign that says duplication teams. So there are things like that election officials have learned to try and make sure that they are culling down the number of instances that can be taken out of context and weaponized. So that's some of the good news in this moment. Some of the bad news in the moment is that we are facing more sophisticated actors with fewer support networks. And what I mean by that is that when I mentioned that everything old is new again, putting out wrong information for voters is as old as voting in the United States, trying to game the system a little bit from the political perspective, telling people election day has changed or your polling place has been changed or what have you. And now we have to deal with deep fakes, AI, and foreign adversaries who are still amplifying those messages. And I think that election administrators in some regard feel a little bit abandoned by some law enforcement and some federal partners that they had come to rely upon in the past. And so into that void, we have nonprofits and others that are stepping in, trying to provide that support network. But here's the other kicker is that, many states passed laws to preclude and prohibit election officials from obtaining any sort of private funding in their capacity. Now, whether that is a scholarship to take a training or, help with travel to go to a conference, or the use of a tool online to be able to figure out exactly how many poll workers they need to keep their lines under 30 minutes. If those things are being paid for by philanthropic dollars, in some states, those election officials aren't able to leverage that support. So we have an instance where nobody wants foreign governments and foreign adversaries to have a role in our elections, to have an influence on our election officials. But we also need to make sure that the election officials have access to all the tools that aid them in doing what is continuing to evolve into a more and more complex and complicated job.
Thank you so much. This was a great tour of the election landscape. And we know as we go forward to next November, this information will become really valuable to us. And we'll be back in touch. And thank you for being our inaugural guest.
It's my honor. It's great to see you both. Thank you all.